Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Reflections on The Soldier and the Hunchback, an essay by Aleister Crowley. An outside link to the full text of this essay is included in the description box below. When I was a student in the College of Thelemic, Phyllis Seckler assigned this essay to everybody as part of her infamous Course 1. I think she recognized that this somewhat neglected text was placed in the very first issue of the Equinox, released in 1909, for a reason. Namely, that it neatly summarizes a major argument of Crowley's early pre-Thelemic writings, that the cultivation of samadhi is the key to unlock the potential of scientific illuminism. But what precisely is unlocked? To critique this text, admittedly with hindsight, in terms of Crowley's subsequent development of Thelemic, is therefore to examine why its argument provides a necessary but not sufficient basis for what will become the Thelemic theory of magic. What, in other words, is both present and missing from the conclusions of this essay that Crowley's imminent acceptance of the Book of the Law will complete the picture of? I certainly don't have in mind any kind of fideism or religious faith in the alleged praeterhuman quality of the Book of the Law as the solution. Such an answer would remain abstract and formal. No, rather, what specific gnosis, what concrete body of knowledge is present in Thelemic that this essay implicitly anticipates, yet does not quite yet fully formulate? The subject matter of The Soldier and the Hunchback is the status, function, and meaning of skepticism in the context of the practice of scientific illuminism. Not unlike a Socratic dialogue, the text enacts an analysis of its theme in the style of a witty conversation with the reader. Nevertheless, a philosophical argument is being laid out, and that argument is basically as follows. In the first part of the essay, Crowley argues that skepticism is serious about asking questions with the goal of finding good answers. Therefore, the skepticism he is interested in is concerned with being unbiased and not with using skepticism as a cover for the assertion of prejudice, bigotry, and other forms of maliciously motivated stupidity. Nor does Crowley find it legitimate to use skepticism to justify suspending judgment merely out of intellectual laziness, otherwise known as the "but how do we know anything" school of vulgar superficiality. Truth matters, Crowley insists. He writes, "Indolence is no virtue in a questioner. Eagerness, intentness, concentration, vigilance, all these I include in the connotation of skeptic." For Crowley, the really important philosophical insight disclosed by the skeptical method is not the abstract and obvious triviality that it is always possible to find some reason to doubt any assertion, but rather that skepticism leads him to anti-foundationalist conclusions. In other words, the philosophical issue raised by skepticism is not that anything goes. Only the lazy skeptic wastes their time with this kind of claim. Rather, for the genuine skeptic, there is no real difficulty in finding rationally plausible answers to their questions. However, every answer leads to more questions, and so on and so forth in an infinite regress. This logical feature of all semiotic systems leads Crowley to the awareness that the whole linguistic cognitive system of any possible inquiry is ultimately ungrounded, foundationless, lacking in any means to establish the absolute and a priori truth of any assertion. In other words, truth cannot be formally established. It can only be practically presupposed and then either supported or refuted by experience. In part 2, Crowley gives an example of applied skepticism to deconstruct René Descartes' famous argument that the proposition cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am, is an absolute a priori truth upon which it is possible to base other truths, which can then also be known to be true, like the chain of reasoning in a mathematical proof. Crowley argues that I think, therefore I am, presumes that the quality of existence or being applies to thought, without adequately defining or demonstrating what such a quality might be. Also, to predicate thinking may or may not presuppose a thinker as the subject of said predication, and this linkage has again only been presumed, not proven. In other words, Crowley writes, the proof rests not upon itself but upon the validity of our logic. And if by logic we mean, as we should mean, the code of the laws of thought, the irritating skeptic will have many more remarks to make. In parts 3 and 4 of the essay, Crowley is led on by this chain of skeptical inquiry to the next question: what is existence? He concludes that the question is so fundamental that it finds no answer. Furthermore, all depends on our logic and upon its whole structure. And so again, skeptical inquiry, taken to its logical conclusion, discovers that the whole system of language used to express thought, indeed that is the very structure of thought, lacks any absolute warrant underlying its judgments. In part 5, Crowley argues that any appeal to God is useless to get out of the crisis of foundations posed by skepticism. Descartes had believed that the ontological argument would get him out of the hole dug by the skeptical chain of thought that led him to posit the cogito in the first place as the bedrock of knowledge. However, pretty much no one has ever been fully satisfied with Descartes' insertion of the ontological argument at this stage of the Meditations on First Philosophy, and Crowley isn't satisfied either. Invoking the existence of God isn't going to help anything, and so Crowley therefore declares that he is an agnostic, the polite term for an atheist in Victorian society. In part 6, the essay pivots, introducing the theme of the soldier and the hunchback, or answers, represented by the exclamation point, in contrast to questions, symbolized by the question mark. Crowley's point being that within the dialectic of philosophical debate, one always precedes and follows the other without end, due to the inherent regress underlying any possible positive, or for that matter negative, assertion to which skepticism is applied. However, samadhi, Crowley claims, provides an interruption to this process, and even possibly provides an experiential and practical basis upon which to practice constructive philosophy again. Yet, how can samadhi possibly be proved given skepticism? It can't, of course, and so, interestingly, and perhaps unexpectedly, Crowley appeals to common sense. This maneuver does not come out of nowhere. It is, in fact, David Hume's antidote to his own corrosive deployment of skepticism in his An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, as well as something like the general view of the common sense school of philosophy associated with the so-called Scottish Enlightenment of the late 17th century. In other words, the solution to general skepticism is to abandon the methodology of searching for general proofs in favor of a pragmatic empiricism supported by scientific rationalism. Crowley thinks that such an empiricism would, in principle, have no difficulty acknowledging the experience of samadhi, so that, as Crowley succinctly puts it, I keep my skepticism intact and I keep my samadhi intact. My critique of Crowley's argument up to this point is that while he is failing forward quite productively, his appeal to common sense ultimately results in a step backwards in the methodological clarity of his argument, rather than the constructive move forward that he is grasping towards in this still transitional essay. Specifically, I think he lacks the methodological clarity offered by Edmund Husserl's phenomenology and Martin Heidegger's hermeneutics, developed a little later into the 20th century, both of which manage to say better what I think Crowley is trying to express in this essay. Crowley is groping towards a method for using skepticism to bracket the data of experience from the demand for certainty by suspending the need for their proof in favor of a creative, speculative openness to the questioning, investigation, and interpretation of phenomenal experience, interpreted apart from traditionally metaphysical ways of framing how understanding is supposed to work. In other words, by dispensing with the unreasonable demand for rational certainty, deeper rational clarity becomes possible into the way the practical interpretation of our experience works. Crowley writes, I find it hard, almost impossible, to get people to understand what seems to me so very simple a point. He attempts to make this point in part 7 of the essay, where Crowley proposes the need to specify what plane or viewpoint one is considering when asking questions. Does one question from the viewpoint of general skepticism or of practical experience? Crowley's idea is that one can philosophically doubt the existence of the entire phenomenal domain, but only consistently in its totality. As he puts it, academic skepticism is a wholesale firm. Regarding the varied furniture of the phenomenal plane taken singly and in relation to each other, general skepticism gives, he says, no grounds for discriminating between them. Although skepticism discloses the lack of an ultimate metaphysical warrant or ground for the faculty of judgment as such, awareness of this feature of judgment is an abstract formalism that does not, in and of itself, contribute a criterion for making use of said faculty, which all of us must practically do all the time. Here, Crowley has put his finger on what is missing from this essay, a criterion for a practical plan of action. With its pragmatic injunction, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, the philosophy of Thelemic will provide the needed tool for discernment. In the meantime, the soldier and the hunchback seems to be offering the phenomenon of samadhi as a candidate, yet without adequately defining either what samadhi is or how it would provide a criterion for practical judgment. Indeed, it seems that samadhi is like skeptical aporia, and that it cuts the ground out from under the total field of our experience. It does not, in and of itself, show us how to navigate it. In part 8 of the essay, Crowley further develops the distinction between the philosophical and practical points of view, or metaphysical and empirical perspectives, which he symbolizes by Kether and Malkut, respectively, with Tifereth as the term mediating the extremes of the height and base of the tree of life. Malkut is the world of asia, or action, and of practical experience, whereas Kether represents the view of reality from the perspective of the aporia of both skepticism and samadhi. As established by the argument in part 7, these viewpoints do not affect each other, so why bother with Kether at all? Crowley quips, in short, why not be a clean living Irish gentleman? However, he argues, there is the perspective of the man in Tifereth, midway between Kether and Malkut, who is trying to raise his consciousness from Malkut to Kether. From this viewpoint, quote, he goes about contradicting Malkut. He refuses to allow Malkut to obsess his thought. He keeps on crying out that there is no difference between a goat and a god, unquote. Furthermore, this man performs great magic. And so from the practical point of view, this is the really interesting position to be in. There is then a practically meaningful difference between the initiate and the common herd animal of humanity, from the one who wishes only to remain at the level of Malkut, in contradistinction from the one who wants to try to incorporate the implications of the view from Kether into the public commons of Malkut. Yet, if the goal is to be the initiate, then Crowley will need to do better than to conservatively appeal to common sense as the context within which to make such a discernment. What does all of this have to do with samadhi, though? Where is the coherent program statement on how the man in Tiferet is to make something of the truth disclosed by skepticism that there is no absolute truth? The Soldier and the Hunchback is written from the viewpoint of apprehension, not of action. The Book of the Law provides the desired guidebook if one wants to actually undertake the journey towards Kether. Part 9 of the essay concludes with a rising series of aspirational assertions, including an introduction to the theme of a nothing beyond even the unity of samadhi, a hint of the doctrine of the Kabbalistic zero, so prominent in the Book of the Law and the Thelemic philosophy based on its synthesis of magic and mysticism. Yet how this all is supposed to get worked out is only tentatively indicated in The Soldier and the Hunchback. However, what is present in this fascinating essay are the lineaments of a theory of the magical will as a drive to self-fulfillment that arises in and as the transcendence of the conventional boundaries of self-experience, and the claim that both skepticism and samadhi give access to this dimension of transcendence. Love is the law, love under will.